Hello. Welcome to today's webinar, Implementing WIOA for Individuals Facing Barriers to Employment, Lessons Learned and Strategies for the Future. My name is Carrie Felton. I'm with Heartland Alliance's National Initiatives on Poverty and Economic Opportunity. I will be facilitating today's webinar. I'm really excited to hear from all our awesome speakers today. Before I hand things over to our speakers, let's quickly touch on some logistics. Everyone listening to the webinar is muted. You can use the chat box on the control panel on the side of your screen to ask questions at any time. We have reserved time at the end of the webinar to allow presenters time to respond to questions. So please send your questions along the way, and we'll be collecting those for the end. A common question we get is, will the slides be made available? And yes, they will. You'll receive an email with a link to our website once the slides and a recording of the webinar are posted. And finally, for those of you who are on Twitter, we invite you to tweet along with us using the hashtag WIOA4All that you see at the bottom of each slide. So before I hand it over to our wonderful speakers, I will share just a little bit about us. The National Initiatives team is a part of Heartland Alliance, a nearly 130-year-old human rights and social service organization headquartered in Chicago. As you see here, our team is dedicated to ending chronic unemployment and poverty. We often say that we work at the intersection of research, policy, and practice to affect change. And one of our national initiatives is the National Center on Employment and Homelessness, or NCEH, which works to make sure that increasing access to quality jobs is a key strategy in preventing and ending homelessness. Today's webinar topic obviously fits within the work we've done through NCEH. And so to give us a little bit of background and context for what our speakers are going to share today, we have our National Initiative Director, Melissa Young. So I will turn it over to Melissa.
Thanks so much, Carrie, and welcome to everyone listening in from across the country on our webinar today. You know, we're really thrilled in many respects to bring this webinar full circle. So about a year and a half ago, we brought together many of the speakers who will be on today's webinar to talk about what was going on in their local communities as WIOA was being implemented. Many of the speakers around the call today were just in the early stages of thinking through at the local and the state level what it meant to implement WIOA in their context and what it meant for WIOA to really serve the employment, education, training, and support service needs of people facing barriers to employment. So we're really coming back full circle with these advocates, with these program providers, and with these funders to talk with them about what's happened since and what progress they've seen, what challenges and successes that they've had. So thank you so much for all of them for joining us and for all of you listening in. Go ahead and next slide, Carrie, and we'll just do a little bit of level setting in this first slide about what is WIOA and really how can we or how we might think about WIOA in the context of workforce development services. So you'll see on the slide in front of you that same, but different. For those of you who have maybe spent any time in Asia, you know that there is a phrase that is oftentimes used that's same, but different, and what that means, right? Well, in the context of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, we really want to tee up that we've seen some things in the passage of the new legislation that are similar to the structure that we've seen in the previous legislation, but we've also seen some opportunities for the system to look different on the ground for people experiencing barriers to employment. So first and foremost, WIOA was signed into law in 2014, and it replaced WIA, the Workforce Investment Act. States and communities have been working ever since on implementation, and we're going to hear more about those experiences in a few minutes. We've brought these folks back together, as we just said, to really update us on what has been happening since the early implementation of this piece of legislation. It's important to remember, though, for folks on the call, that WIOA sets forth the structure of the workforce system, much like for those of you who might be listening from the Homeless Services System, that the HEARTH Act establishes the COC structure. WIOA sets forth that structure of the workforce development system. But WIOA is also a service delivery funding mechanism. It's important to think about these things as distinct from one another, particularly because we know that other funding streams, such as SNAP ENT, TANF, CDBG, and others, can be leveraged to provide workforce development services in communities. As it relates to the structure of the WIOA system, not a whole lot has changed in the passage of WIOA. WIOA establishes the system as a universal system, meaning that anyone can receive services. The governance structure of state and local planning boards was largely left intact in the WIOA passage. The makeup of who sits on some of those planning boards was also largely left alone. And as many of you know, the majority of those folks sitting around those tables are employer partners and businesses. The funding categories structured as adult, dislocated worker, and youth were also largely left intact as well. What we saw in terms of significant change or potential for significant change on the local level was on the service delivery side of the equation, on really WIOA as a service delivery mechanism. WI sets forth that one of the purposes of the system should be to serve the employment, education, training, and support service needs of people facing barriers to employment. We also saw a greater prioritization of youth and adults with barriers to employment for services. We saw a focus of the legislation on establishing and promoting and funding career pathways. And we saw, for the first time ever, transitional jobs programs as an allowable use of WIOA funds. Finally, WIOA required new partnerships that influence the service delivery side of the equation. For example, for folks listening in, WIOA required that the TANF system be a mandated partner of the system. Finally, another piece of the equation on the service delivery side is that the performance metrics now within the WIOA system are intended to reflect the characteristics of people being served and the communities in which are being served. All that said, on the service delivery side of the spectrum, WIOA provides a great deal of discretion to state and local systems to determine their strategies, target populations, and funding priorities. This is one of the primary reasons why we've developed this planning and implementation toolkit that you'll see on your screen. There's a link at the bottom of that slide to the toolkit, but one of the things that we set forth in that toolkit, which we think is really important and really should anchor our conversation today, is that because WIOA allows for a tremendous amount of discretion at the state and local level for communities to design their programs and design initiatives, it really does require and bring forth the need for a range of different actors to be supporting implementation across the country. So our toolkit really talks about what advocates, community-based service providers, public system leaders, philanthropy, and researchers can be doing to support the implementation of this legislation for folks facing barriers to employment in communities. So I'll pause there and turn the webinar back over to Carrie and the rest of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope that there's a lot to be gained.
Thank you, Melissa. So yeah, I hope that gives folks a little bit of background into why we're doing, what brought us to this webinar today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our first set of speakers. Heidi Schmidt Boyd from Hennepin County in Minnesota, Brian Paulsen from the PoliCLABS Family Foundation. I'm pretty sure Brian is on here. He was coming from another webinar, so if not, I'll let Heidi take it over. So
Thank you, Carrie. Good afternoon. This is Heidi Schmidt Boyd. I work in housing stability for Hennepin County, which is in central Minnesota. Previously, I was with the Minneapolis-Hennepin County Office to End Homelessness, where I work to integrate employment into our housing and homeless programs. And for the past year, I've been part of an upstream focus on preventing homelessness through our mainstream services. So in this work, I've been very hopeful about the opportunity that WIOA provides for communities, especially those interested in serving priority populations. So I just wanted to give a quick context for Hennepin County. Our 2016 census showed close to 1 million people aged 16 and older. We have 2 workforce investment boards, one comprised of the city of Minneapolis, and the second workforce board is basically the rest of Hennepin County, which is primarily suburban. Our current unemployment rate is 3%. However, our racial inequity in unemployment is generally some of the worst in the nation. The last official report from 2016 showed our overall unemployment in the county at 4%, but for Caucasians, it's around 3%, and for African Americans or those of 2 or more races, it was just over 9%. Next slide, please. So in preparing for this webinar, Heartland asked us to talk about our biggest challenge, and I would have to say that our biggest challenge is leaving the comfort zone. So we generally meet our performance measures across the board in Hennepin County and in the state of Minnesota. And we also do serve people with barriers to employment, including those experiencing homelessness. A recent WIOA report card showed that about 2.5% of the people in the adults and about 10% of people in the WIOA youth programs were people experiencing homelessness. But our challenge is really to leave that comfort zone of serving a known population to having a shared commitment to addressing our racial disparities, which persist throughout our social network systems, including homelessness. And really, as a state, our challenge is to talk with and provide technical assistance to local workforce boards to create new measures of success for serving priority populations, including such things as measuring interim skill gains or modifying employment and earnings measures that make sense for people with barriers to employment. And now, if Brian's around, I'm going to pass it off to Brian Paulson, who'll talk more about our successes currently and what we hope to see in the future in Hennepin County. And maybe Brian isn't there yet. So I'm happy to just keep plugging along. And if Brian is able to call in or chime in, that would be great. So as far as our success locally in WIOA, my experience has been primarily with our WIOA youth programs. And really, we have success in having kind of an increased recognition of what this means and the opportunities it provides to better serve our out-of-school youth. And so through that, we've really created some local partnerships between WIOA youth providers and our homeless youth providers. And we've done that by actually, having mixers and meet and greets. So those practitioners that are serving similar youth can effectively come together. And I think they've been able to realize the limits of both the workforce system and the homeless youth system, and have had success in doing shared case management. So able to literally, if a workforce center is unable to keep track of homeless youth, they're able to connect with the homeless youth provider and say, hey, I've lost, can't find this client, can you help me? And then they've been able to support each other with that kind of shared case management model. Next slide, please. And then thinking about kind of our future strategies that we hope to employ, one thing that we see real opportunity with is modeling, to see the impact on our performance measures if we did commit to serving more people in these priority populations. So like I said initially, our challenge is really kind of leaving that comfort zone, and we feel like modeling to see the impact will really help us feel more comfortable in taking that commitment to serving people with barriers. So looking at the impact it would have on our funding and helping to build a business case to show, you know, the impact overall of serving people, bringing people out of homelessness, bringing them into the workforce system and the workforce sector. So the return on investment of being able to move these people out of shelter, supporting their families, etc. So that's what we see in Hennepin County, and I'll pass it on to Colorado.
Thanks, Heidi. I think Brian may have accidentally joined as a panelist instead of us. I mean, as a attendee instead of a panelist. Fine, you did a great job sharing. I love the picture of the fish and leaving the comfort zone. It's a very good lesson. So next, we're going to hear from Shar Robert, Laura Ware from the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. So I will let them take it over. Go ahead.
Thank you, Carrie. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry. So, and this is our contact information, which will be on the slides. So CCLP was formed in 1998 to advocate for changes in laws and rules on behalf of those who live in poverty. Staff fought for access to public benefit and also advocated for a state EITC to help make low-wage work pay enough to meet basic needs. SNAP, TANF, and other benefits now include work requirements, challenging people and our systems to create real opportunity and not just to discourage people from seeking help. Work can be an antidote to poverty. Relevant training can improve the odds of stable employment with the path to career upward mobility. CCLP coordinates the Skills to Compete Coalition. It's a multi-sector policy advocacy coalition. Its focus is access to training for middle skill jobs where the most job openings go unfilled. In the past few years, Skills to Compete has advocated for what we think is missing from Colorado's workforce development discussion, which is access to employment and training for adults with barriers to employment. It successfully advocated for the creation and funding of adult education workforce partnership, recognition of the alternatives to the GED for high school diploma, and integrated basic education and skills training. Last year, thanks to the Butler Family Fund, we contracted with Laura Ware to address how well people who have experienced homelessness were being served by WIOA. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to her. And next slide.
Hi. So I was contracted to determine what was going on across the state of Colorado with respect to the workforce areas and the homeless delivery systems, and so to a certain degree the poverty system in terms of serving homeless people and other people who have significant barriers. And so the things that we really kind of were looking at was service coordination, systems coordination, and also the responsiveness of each of those systems to think about work and how the supports that were needed could be incorporated together. The thing that I wanted to really emphasize for I think some of the workforce areas and some of the regions in Colorado, which differ considerably between the rural and urban areas, was that there, in a lot of the places there was limited understanding about the coordination that is needed, as well as the eligibility requirements between the different systems. And I think that the other thing that I learned in general from talking to so many different counties across the state, just as a note, we talked to about 62 of the 64 counties and their representatives in the homeless and workforce delivery systems. And through those conversations, but also talks with the participants, we learned that they really would like to see more mobility of services, so services coming to meet with them, and diversity of job opportunities that start in different places based on what their current capabilities are. One innovative idea that we ran into that was really fun was one of the counties goes to a local YMCA and does outreach and enrollment of all the families into the workforce center while the mothers in the families are doing a Zumba class. So being innovative and being mobile was something that was really determining better results. Next slide, please. For the project, we were looking at policy coordination and policy recommendations, not so much direct services in any of the specific areas. But I think that the challenges that we ran into are kind of highlighted on this slide, and a lot of the emphasis kind of ranged between not knowing what some of the community resources are, especially in the larger urban areas, especially in the area of homeless employment services. There's quite a bit of knowledge about basic needs and how to meet those, whether it's food and clothing and obviously applications for SNAP, et cetera. But for the workforce areas, really understanding the breadth of potential employment community resources that could be coordinated with, there was a pretty limited understanding in certain areas. This is probably obvious, and it's probably true in every state, but in Colorado, we really ran into the fact that rural and urban areas are so incredibly different, not only in how they view the challenge of serving homelessness and addressing workforce issues with respect to people with barriers, but each county in Colorado has a very large amount of autonomy. It's just the way the state is structured. So coordination from the state level is really often given back to the counties. And so that creates a lot of individual determinations that are not only housed at the local level, but it's somewhat complicated for a homeless person to navigate. Here in the Metro Denver area, as an example, we have 7 counties that are part of the area. So you have 7 different sets of county commissioners who are making determinations about how different public systems are implemented and also how the systems interface with each other and where different programs are housed. So that became a very large emphasis in my research in terms of how do homeless people and people with barriers get their needs met, especially when they go from one county to another. And then the last thing I think that was very emphasized, especially in the larger urban areas, was that there was a lot of challenges to get the eligibility requirements to align with each other. For example, if you were trying to qualify for housing in the continuum of care in Denver and to also align for eligibility for WIOA, it was difficult because of different eligibility requirements where timing and income levels and other factors would be contradictory to each other. Another, next slide, please. Challenges with WIOA itself that we ran into in our research was that limited funds. One of the things that we were told from different places was in addition to the funding reductions that people have received in the last 3 to 6 months from the federal allocation of WIOA to the state of Colorado, we also, our allocation shifted because of our low unemployment rate here, which is understandable in the context of a pro rata kind of thinking. However, the hard to serve people have a higher instance of unemployment or may not even be registered in unemployment context. So it has impacted the ability of the workforce areas to serve low income and people with barriers even more difficult, making it more difficult to serve them. As I mentioned earlier, the eligibility requirements for each program makes it difficult to braid the funding sources. And one thing that I totally ran into that we didn't realize before was that WIOA services are no longer able to provide support services to Colorado workers once they begin working. So for low-income people with barriers, that has been very problematic. That was brought forward by numerous direct service workers across the state. And the last thing I think that would be something that we have talked about considerably is that sector partnerships in Colorado are obviously focused on middle skill jobs, but there's a real desire on the part of most of our partners to look at creating sector partnerships that start at a lower level and provide supports along the way so that people can advance to higher levels sectors, but over time. Next slide, please. I think the next slide is community needs. And just kind of thinking about community needs, I think there's a significant amount of need for more collaboration and integration between all of the partners, especially the homeless delivery system, not only with the housing resources, but also employment providers. The community expressed need for longer term services, for more behavioral health resources that support employment. And as I mentioned, trying to cultivate longer term relationships with employers and then redefining the idea of career pathways and sector partnerships so that if they can really begin from where someone is currently in terms of their skills and their ability to work. And then the last slide, please. What people can do, this is the others that we are really excited about at this point. I think we're working closely with employers to really think about who they hire. And the thing that Shar and I and others of our team are working on now that's very exciting is that we're developing some legislative initiatives that would bring actual new resources from the state itself to provide a more flexible group of support services in the context of capacity for the state and the workforce areas, as well as direct services to the individual people. I think the last thing I would just say is that the more you reach out to the multi-sector group that are thinking about workforce, not just the mandated partners, the more chance we have to serve this population. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shar and Laura. That was a tremendous amount of great information about Colorado that I think will be valuable to lots of different communities. So our next speaker is Will Heaton from the Center for Employment Opportunities, and I'll let Will talk a little bit more about his experience.
Thanks so much, Carrie, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Next slide, please. And we can go one more. So as Carrie had said, I am Will Heaton. I serve as the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at the Center for Employment Opportunities, or more oftenly known as CEO. And we're a national nonprofit that provides employment services to men and women who have recently been released from incarceration. And the way that the program works, just to provide a little bit of context, at the front of the call here is soon after somebody is released from incarceration, they come to CEO where they enroll in a week-long orientation course where we're providing them with a lot of life skills training and really helping prepare them for what to expect in a workplace environment, because for well over 60 to 70% of the men and women we work with, this is the first time that they'll have any formal work experience. And so then after they go through the program, they are immediately employed by CEO to work as a member of one of our transitional work teams that we operate all across the country. And 3 to 4 days a week, They work in a team of 5 to 7 people, developing a lot of, different types of core workplace skills in a work-based learning environment. And then one additional day each week, they come to the office where they meet one-on-one with a job coach who's helping provide other support services such as resume building, practicing interviewing skills, and just navigating some of the other barriers that so often accompany a felony conviction. And then after working for a period of time in the transitional work phase of our program, they achieve what we call Job Start Ready, where they're connected with one of our staff who is a job developer and has a network of employer contacts throughout the local community. And we're matching our participants up with those employers where they're hired into unsubsidized jobs. And then once somebody is placed into that job, CEO staff remain in touch and working with them for up to an additional year, providing ongoing support services just to ensure that they have the stability necessary to stay employed. And we're not just focusing on placing somebody, but helping them stay connected to the workforce over the long time. And then as part of our program as well, we provide opportunities for our clients to receive a number of different types of credential and certifications, such as OSHA certifications and other types of job training that's very much matched with what the high sector or in-demand jobs are in each of the locations where we work, so that we're really starting to align much more closely with the objectives of the workforce development system. Next slide, please. So CEO now today serves a little bit over 5,000 people a year, and we work in these 6 states that are currently highlighted in green, with plans to expand into about 3 or 4 more over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. But what that's really enabled us to do is to work with a lot of state and local workforce development entities and start to build expertise in some of the differing priorities based on different states, what their economies revolve around, and sort of what the labor and employer demands are. And so I think when WIOA was passed, and really begun to be implemented by Department of Labor and then the states and ultimately the localities, we really saw an opportunity of how we could much more closely integrate our own work in with that of local workforce boards. And so next slide, please. What I wanted to share with everyone today a little bit is just some of the challenges that we've encountered as a direct services organization working in some of these different localities, but then also what some of the successes are. So one of the things that was, had really prevented CEO prior to 2014 when WIOA was passed, or even I would say further than that into 2016 when it was actually being implemented, was that a lot of the work performance goals that were set by the federal government made it extremely difficult for workforce boards or the one-stop centers or job centers to work with the type of individuals that CEO is serving, because everyone has at least one, if not multiple, felony convictions, which is obviously an extremely high barrier to employment. But then CEO's participants also usually have the average of about a 7th to 8th grade math and reading skill level. And so they're very much more focused on, we're helping them develop some of those core skills before they can really start transitioning into positions that are more focused around, middle skills or whatnot. And so when WIOA was passed, the emphasis on serving, individuals that had much higher barriers to employment, it really put CEO in a better position of how when we partner with local workforce boards, we could really help them in meeting some of those new requirements under WIOA. And so while that's still continue to be a challenge, as I think we're building in all of the communities where we work or we're seeking to expand, is really just helping those those workforce leaders understand what CEO does and how working with a community partner like us can really help the workforce boards or the other employers in the area both fill a lot of open labor positions, especially given how tight the labor market is right now, but also how they can take advantage of new career services allowable under WIOA, such as transitional jobs that Melissa had referenced at the top of the call. So some of the successes where we've really been able to do that, I would say, is first in Pennsylvania, their state WIOA plan actually mandates that local workforce boards have to use some of their Title I funds to fund transitional jobs programs. And so CEO, now works in Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and Pittsburgh. And we've been working with some of those local workforce boards to varying degrees to actually be a partner in the community that can operate those transitional jobs programs for the workforce board. And the partnership that we've had in Pittsburgh, especially over the course of the last year or more, has definitely been a great experience for us and really helping us kind of better understand how we can adapt our model further to really work alongside the workforce board and helping them meet the community objectives that they're seeking to achieve. And I think what we were able to do there as well, though, is now thinking about that state plan and how it really set the precedent for the localities to sort of adopt or think about how they can adopt transitional jobs, is now working with other state workforce boards across the country in terms of as they're revising their state workforce plans that are going to have to be submitted to the Federal Department of Labor again next year, kind of having similar practices and really sort of recognizing that there are certain services that are especially well positioned to serve people in the community that need more of that low skill focus, and definitely meet a lot of those higher barrier populations that WIOA is intended to serve. I think of the second success that we've had, though, in California is we were really able to work with the state workforce board and then some of the counties to take advantage of some of the governor's discretionary funds. And here, given a lot of focus on how to provide more employment opportunities to the returning citizen community in California, the state workforce board was using a lot of those discretionary funds specifically to focus in this area. And so again, CEO, working with other organizations, including PolicyLink, who you're going to hear from shortly, have been great allies in terms of how we as a direct service organization are going to provide a solution to, the local and the state workforce entities and reaching that community in a very effective way. So I think just a couple of recommendations that I would offer up based on what we've been able to learn over the last couple of years is one, just in the communities where you work, but I think especially at the state level, is identifying who some of these champions are that are really trying to emphasize sort of the aspects of WIOA that are meant to serve people that have much higher barriers to employment. And then as you're identifying those, kind of using your own organizations as a way to essentially provide them with those solutions. And I think the second thing then is what CEO has also been able to do is we are able to braid or help the workforce entity braid together a lot of different funding. And so at a couple of our different sites, in addition to the workforce dollars, which are federal, we actually can help bring together state corrections dollars that are earmarked for vocational training and weave those together within our program. So it helps the workforce entities meet that other requirement in WIOA in terms of creating a much more integrated system. And then on a large number of our sites as well, we're actually able to take advantage of SNAP employment and training dollars. And while those can't be used to directly leverage WIOA dollars because they're both federal funding, we've been able to find ways to sort of direct them to different aspects of our program. And then I think the last thing is just we've constantly in every conversation, CEO, the way that we begin those is how we can offer ourselves up as a solution and really helping the workforce boards meet some of those new objectives that they're required to meet. And I think as we've been able to come to the table with that type of perspective, it's really opened up some conversations where even though we're working with a part of the community that's oftentimes much harder to place, there's an increasing amount of receptivity, recognizing that CEO is that direct services program can help the workforce board as opposed to them having to create their own program. So I'll finish there, Carrie. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Will. That was really helpful, I think, to have a service provider's perspective on how you can coordinate with states and localities. So next we're going to hear from Erika from PolicyLink, as Will mentioned. And so Erika, I will just let you take it away.
Great, thank you, Carrie. Next slide. So as Carrie mentioned, my name is Erika Rincon, and I work with PolicyLink. And today I'm going to speak to specifically the work that we've been doing on WIOA implementation here in California at the state level. Next slide. So just some quick background on PolicyLink. We are a national research and action institute dedicated to advancing racial and economic equity for low-income communities and people of color. And most of our work on WIOA implementation has actually been through the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, which is a statewide coalition that we helped to convene in California, comprised of community organizations and advocacy groups and youth leaders and philanthropy and other stakeholders that are all working to improve outcomes for boys and young men of color across the state. Next slide. So a lot of our advocacy work over the sort of year and a half that the development of the state plan process was underway was really focused on advocating for a much stronger framework and guidance that was very supportive of addressing the needs of boys and young men of color and other populations that are facing the most significant barriers to employment. And I think a lot of folks on the phone, on the webinar, have already mentioned the sort of the success that we've, gotten in a lot of the language now through WIOA, and similarly in California. I mean, we do have some stronger language that is, I think very helpful. But unfortunately, and similar to what others have said, the real issue that we continue to see is that there's just inadequate resources to accomplishing these types of goals around serving folks with barriers to employment that is now laid out. And I think, it unfortunately, not only are we experiencing, less resources, we're not seeing a lot of support for a real cultural shift at the local level. So I think in addition to actually getting increased resources to local boards and one-stops, we also need to be providing comprehensive support and infrastructure that gets folks, that allows people to better serve these vulnerable populations. I think, in some areas of the state, there is a lot more experience in addressing the needs of, for example, out-of-school youth or other folks, but in many areas, they don't have extensive experience. And a lot of this goes back to the way, WIA was rolled out, in that it kind of acted more as a disincentive to serving this population. So I think in addition to resources, we actually need real support and infrastructure, whether that's through training or what, to really shift how things have traditionally been done at the local level. And one opportunity, though, that I think is a step towards this direction is the recent passage of AB 1111, and a state assembly bill that was signed recently by the governor here, that was authored by Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia and co-sponsored by the California Workforce Association, La Cooperativa, and PolicyLink, which will help to invest in partnerships between community-based organizations and local workforce development boards in preparing individuals with barriers to employment to connect to, enter, and succeed in more advanced workforce training programs. And we do have a statute definition of individuals with barriers to employment that is pretty encompassing. It includes, farm workers, informally incarcerated, and people on public assistance, out-of-school youth, and other populations. And so I think this is a step in the right direction in that it's attempting to try to shift how the system has historically been operating on the ground, and also try to better integrate community-based organizations into the workforce system and really leverage the expertise that they're bringing that a lot of times is not something that's held in a similar way across the region. And next slide. And so I think, a lot of this has already been said, so I won't stay on this too long, but just as far as, strategies, we've actually been conducting also some research with the broader sort of workforce system here in the Bay Area with regard to barriers and opportunities in serving boys and young men of color. And something that we have heard from folks on the ground is that they do not find that there's hardly any money in WIOA, so that's not actually helping them all that much, but that they do see a lot more funds, whether that's through social service agencies or through the SNAP employment and training dollars. I think a lot of this was already mentioned, that there is workforce money in a lot of other programs, and it's in many ways it's amounting to more dollars. So but the other thing that we're hearing is that people aren't actually leveraging this money. So we're not seeing a lot of folks go after, in California, it's called the CalFresh employment and training dollars. And also that folks find that these resources are a lot more flexible than WIOA dollars. And then I think another sort of strategy that we're starting to see a little bit in California is that at the end of the day, we can't just keep creating new programs. So a new, even with this Breaking Barriers to Employment initiative that's been created, we can't just invest in one-off type of programs, but that we obviously need broader systems change work. And I think that that's starting to be recognized by our California Workforce Development Board. And the example that I'll share is that with regard to the re-entry population, we have worked with we have worked with the board and other organizations around getting a new program in California that is focused on this population. But what we have seen is that, the couple $1 million that are in that type of program are not enough to really address the large need across the state with regards to helping folks transition back into their communities upon release. And so there are now sort of some meetings taking place and conversations between our Department of Corrections and the California Workforce Development Board around how can we actually better leverage the resources in both of these state agencies to figure out how we're serving the reentry population better. I think, obviously they have not really had a shared dialogue in the past at the state level, and this sort of broader systems change work is starting there in hopes, and is starting at the state level in hopes that this will better facilitate this kind of work happening at the local level. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity here. We, despite, some great programs that are happening, I think that this is definitely a way to have a much more lasting impact and a broader impact across the state. And I do think that it should be starting at the state level, which is great. So we'll see what happens as a result. But it is a good step in the right direction. Next slide. And then there is my contact info. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Erika. That was great. Very helpful information. We have one last speaker, and before I turn it over to David, I just want to remind all of the listeners that at any time, feel free to type a question for any of our panelists or all of our panelists in the questions or chat box for our Q&A at the end. So now we're going to finish up with David from the Center on Law and Social Policy, or CLASP, and he's going to tie it all together for us. So I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, Carrie. Next slide, please. And next slide, thank you. So just a little bit about CLASP. CLASP is a national, nonpartisan, anti-poverty nonprofit organization. We work on policy solutions for low-income people, and we work in 5 different issue areas that cover a broad gamut. I work on the workforce training, post-secondary, and adult basic education team, but we also have teams that work specifically on opportunity youth, on child care and early education, on job quality, and on income and work support. So my colleagues here work in a lot of different areas, and we try to look for the ways in which there's overlap. Next slide, please. So what I want to do briefly is just talk about 2 things. You've heard a lot of great tips from my fellow panelists about things we could do going forward, and trying to put them into some big buckets of ways that WIOA, both the funding stream and the structure, can catalyze workforce development that works for low-income people. The first, a couple people have talked about performance measures as an issue. I want to talk about ways in which the performance target setting process is an opportunity to create incentives that were not there under the prior law for the WIOA system to serve more participants with significant barriers to employment, and then to use that encouragement to drive the greater use of service delivery models and strategies that we know work for low-income people. And so there are a number of policies within WIOA that coordinate with the performance target process. They're listed on that slide, but the fact that there's an emphasis on serving low-income adults and adults with basic skills deficiency and receiving public benefits, the emphasis on serving out-of-school youth, the emphasis on planning that Melissa mentioned, as well as career pathways and specific work-based learning options, including transitional jobs, being encouraged by the law. So next slide, please. So the WIOA performance targets are different. The measures that are in the law and the ways in which the targets for those measures are set is different from the prior law. There are interim progress goals. It's not just about whether people get jobs or how much they earn, but also about steps along the way that are designed to create the ability to capture positive outcomes for those who might start farther behind or need more intensive services to ultimately succeed in the workforce. And so 2 of those measures are the measure of whether somebody gets a recognized post-secondary credential, and the measure of interim gains, skill gains. But what they both have in common is this notion that people need to be on a pathway, and that in fact we shouldn't just be encouraging very short-term services for those who can pretty much get right into the workforce with a light touch from the system, but instead we ought to be looking at strategies that might be more resource intensive and help people out more. Is when it comes to actually negotiating these targets, there are in fact incentives, and Melissa touched on the fact that the targets are supposed to be adjusted first set and then also subsequently adjusted based on participant characteristics as well as on what's going on in the economy of the area. In addition, for the first 2 years of WIOA implementation, which is the 2 years ending June 30 of next year, the states were urged to collect the data on the performance measures, but they don't count. They're not being held to funding consequences for failing to meet those numbers. And so this is a baseline opportunity. This is a chance for experimentation. And so it's really, in a number of ways, the feds encourage states and local areas to experiment with trying out innovative models, serving different populations, and using that freedom to experiment to set baseline data for what happens when you try a longer term or more intensive services focused on individuals with barriers. Again, in the past, oftentimes, the workforce system would say, if I serve individuals with barriers, it takes a long time, I won't get any credit for that, I'll lose funding. And so this is an attempt to overturn that presumption and that fear at the local level. The local areas were also encouraged, and the states were encouraged to have a different view of continuous improvement. I put a quote up there, and I have later in this slide deck, which you'll all get, the list of the of all of this guidance from the federal government. But continuous improvement isn't just ever upward ratcheting of your targets year over year. If you did 61% this year, you need to do 62% the next year and 63% the next. That's what continuous improvement sort of used to mean colloquially, and this is a more expanded definition of continuous improvement to say it also might mean an increase in the customer served, a change in exactly which service delivery models you're using. So it is, again, an incentive to try out new things. Next slide, please. So what that leads to for individuals advocating for people with barriers to employment is a chance to bring data to the table, to find out how many individuals there are in a given local area or in a state, parts of a state, in various subpopulations, individuals who are, severely basic skills deficient, individuals who, have a criminal record, individuals who are homeless, whichever group you're looking at. You want to bring the data and you want to compare that to the baseline, to what was the old baseline, and try to have some sense of how those numbers match up. And so, again, the opportunity to bring data that as they're collecting baseline, as they try out new things in WIOA, this is the way to do that, and to say states choosing to serve larger numbers of individuals with significant barriers to employment are encouraged to base their performance goals on data about the expected performance levels for those populations. So if they're going to have impact on outcomes, the federal government basically says, we hope you'll bring us a sense of what that might be, and then we can set the targets accordingly. So it really is, the numbers, right? So if there was 199, there we go, 199 unaccompanied young adults, age 18 to 24, at a point of time in that area, you go and look at those two workforce boards and how many youth are they serving with their WIOA Title I formula funds, and say it was 550 in one area and 250 in the others. It was a little bit over 800 between the two areas. And so then you could actually run a simulation, a model of if we delivered WIOA youth style services for a large number, let's say 150 to try it out, of the 200 unaccompanied young adults in the homelessness survey, what would that do to the performance? And this shows that in several measures, it doesn't actually take them below the passing threshold. It certainly has an impact of 1% or 2% or 3% on the total performance levels, but it's not enough to bring them from passing to failing. And in a couple of others, it brings them right on the bubble. And so it's, again, the level of change that might be part of a conversation taking advantage of the guidance that I showed you on the previous slide that says, adjust these performance targets based on the participants' characteristics. And so, having some sense of how your numbers in fact impact what would happen to the performance measures is a good way to speak the language of WIOA to the workforce boards. And so that's what we're suggesting is a way to do that kind of advocacy. So next slide. Oh, there we go. So again, once you've figured out sort of how the population lines up, the other idea is then to advocate for how WIOA could look different from WIA. What would be a change? What would be a greater amount of the more effective services, the more effective models for low-income people? And so certainly two that are examples that I'll just cover briefly are both career pathways and subsidized work-based learning. And of course, you've heard about both of those from the previous panelists. But what the story is about those, we know that they work. We have good evidence of the effectiveness of those programs, those program models, but they're more intensive. They cost more per participant. They come with supportive services and counseling, as well as job training. In the case of work-based learning, it comes with some form of wage payment or subsidy or stipend. And so in every one of those cases, it really will require braiding funding by having additional funding streams together with WIOA, so that you're making them a case not only about how they can not have too much impact on their performance numbers using the kind of spreadsheet that I showed you before, but also that this is a way for them to partner and bring everyone to the table. Again, the WIOA law encourages these partnerships. It requires people to convene conversations about how they work together. But it's often great to blend that broader conversation that's in the abstract with specific data about specific populations of individuals with barriers to employment, which is the focus and emphasis of WIOA. Next slide. So the work-based training and the work-based learning, these are just examples here, which I have as a resource of all of the different ways in which that's encouraged in WIOA. All of these are ways that individuals can get training while they're also on the job in one form or another. And, just to briefly talk about apprenticeship, which is mentioned at the end, there really is a key need for pre-apprenticeships that serve as on-ramps that are actually tied to real apprenticeship slots, real jobs, and ideally that have with them even in those pre-apprenticeships some form of a stipend or wages, so that the individuals aren't training without having income coming in. And so, those types of bridge programs are often, where work is integrated with other forms of learning, often are well connected to career pathways. Next slide. So the career pathways on-ramps have three components to really help those with significant barriers to educational and economic success make it into the beginnings of a career pathway. As you see on the diagram from the Federal Career Pathway Toolkit, career pathways have multiple entry and exit points. People can be at different stages of learning and skill development and be along a pathway. But for the people who are starting at a lower skill level, there really is a need for on-ramps that not only include the training, the integrated education and training, but also stabilization, support services, as well as counseling, placement, retention, and re-engagement. Career pathways, as defined in the federal law, means they are partnerships. There's no way for a career pathway to be done by a single agency or institution. It has to be in collaboration and partnership to having not only the education and training that's aligned with the skill needs of specific industries, that's preparing people to get credentials that are valuable and known in those industries, that have counseling as well to help individuals, and that really are tied to integrated and contextualized workforce preparation as well as training for a specific job that's all connected together. So next slide. So I'll skip this, but that's the IET model that I've just been talking about, which is very important to build in together with supportive services. And so to wrap up, the things you want to be asking for in these kinds of conversations. Again, you want to bring the data that I described. You want to have some sense of the size of the population you're talking about, and how the WIOA funding stream might align with the numbers of people that need to be served that have barriers. You want to then look at the effective service delivery models, and you want to ask the areas to set goals for the percentages of participants, and ask for those targets, those performance targets, to be set corresponding to some baseline data or some realistic data about what it would look like to serve those individuals. Ideally, you want to ask for co-enrollment. You want to ask for, essentially, when the programs are partnering together, that they co-enroll, that they both take credit for the performance within their own home systems for the individuals that they're serving. And there is a point next year where the 4-year WIOA plans, which again is that opportunity for everyone to come to the table, where those 4-year plans are revised. And so, look for, in those conversations, what's changed in the first 2 years of implementation of WIOA, how much was different, and what kind of goals should we set for the next 2 years. One other point that's on the last bullet on this slide is just that local areas are allowed to vary their goals. They're allowed to, in fact, ask their service providers to have different measures, which then roll up to their own total measures based on who they're serving and what services they provide. And so having a real conversation that's based on data, that doesn't expect everyone to have the same results, but puts it in the context of getting targets that are set realistically based on who you're serving, is a real opportunity to reorient this system so that it does a better job of serving more individuals with barriers to employment. Next slide. The next 2 slides are just some federal resources and some resources from CLASP. And thank you for your attention.
Wow, David, that was great. Some really great things, and just like you said, you will get these slides. You can look more closely at the resources that he shared. So thank you. So with that, we're going to move on to a time of question and answer. You guys have been sending in some great questions. I'm going to turn it over to one of my colleagues, Katie Schnurr, on the National Initiatives team, to moderate this time. Go ahead, Katie.
Great. Thanks so much, Carrie. And yes, we have gotten a bunch of questions, and if you have any additional questions, please feel free to just type them into the chat box, and we'll try to cover them during the Q&A. So a first question that came in that I'm going to direct to Laura and to share is actually a point of clarification. So the question says, in Colorado, WIOA is no longer providing support services funding after people begin working. Is that specific to Colorado's implementation of WIOA?
Well, this is Shar, and we understand that's happening here in Colorado. What I don't know is if it's happening in other places or if it was just a way for Colorado to stay within budget.
There's nothing in WIOA. There's nothing in WIOA that requires that, so that would be a state decision.
Okay.
And kind of the follow-on question there is there any ongoing advocacy to try to address this?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
The main effort that we're taking is to identify new ways to provide support services. And so some of the efforts that we have been pursuing, as I mentioned a little bit in my presentation, was some legislative activities. And so we have 2 potential legislative bills that we are taking forward to our state legislature, presumably finding some sponsors in the next couple weeks. And we're requesting general fund money that would specifically address some of those deficits of support services needs that have been left not only by the by WIOA's implementation here in Colorado, but also by other support service needs that result from people not being eligible for WIOA or other programs.
Great, thank you. So this is a pretty broad question and maybe was covered a bit during the last presentation by David, but I'm gonna toss it out there actually for the group. David, if you wanna weigh in again, please feel free. The question is, one of the obstacles to serving individuals with significant employment needs is in the way WIOA measures success. For instance, if a person with a disability can only work part-time, it lowers the criteria for wage gain and lowers the average of the service provider, which doesn't look good for their statistics. WIOA programs aren't incentivized to work with older workers or individuals with disabilities. How can we fix this?
Well, certainly I would point to, and I blew through it, but the new WIOA regulation that encourages local workforce boards to set up performance measures for their service providers that can be different from the ones that they have for the whole general area, and so that they, based on the populations they're serving, and so that there is the ability to adjust overall. And I think, again, the point is to take that spreadsheet that we did as an example of advocacy, where you would look at how many total homeless youth there were and see how that might fit. If the answer were that, there was 3,000 homeless youth in an area and the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act youth program was only 100 youth, you have a problem there. You're asking for something that that is not probably doable. But as long as you're within the ballpark, what you're asking for is an adjustment for the participants served of different performance measures. That's encouraged in WIOA.
Can I just, this is Laura in Colorado. I just would add that in my observations, we're doing the work across Colorado, that in addition to what was just said by David, I think that another part of the how is working with the workforce areas to learn how to do it, and I think it means changing their mindset about how they deliver services, whether it's through training or submergence experiences in other places, working closer with CBOs, not only to refer them to the CBOs, but to learn from the CBOs and vice versa. So I think it's about changing mindset approach and kind of the feeling that people with disabilities are very capable of getting not only work, but very competitive work.
Great. Anyone else who wants to weigh in around helping to incentivize programs to work with folks who face significant barriers to work? Great. I will move on to the next question. And Heidi and Brian, I'm going to pitch this one over to you, although Sharon and Laura, please feel free to weigh in as well. The question is, you have any suggestions about how a homeless services provider can approach WIOA to work together after a few failed attempts?
Yeah, I can address this. I think what's worked in our community is that the WIOA youth providers have, this new requirement to serve more out-of-school youth, and so they're kind of thrown outside of their comfort zone as well, and have had difficulty figuring out how to reach out-of-school youth. And so the homeless youth providers really can offer, I think they could go to a WIOA youth provider and say, hey, this is what we can do for you. We can help you find these youth. We can help you stay connected to them. We can help you because we have a different approach possibly to services. Youth might trust us more, or might just have a different relationship. And so by those homeless youth providers kind of offering what they can provide in support of WIOA, I think is a great approach.
And this is Brian, and just quickly add that if you've tried this before, even prior to WIOA, know that it is a new day, and I think Heidi has been tremendously effective in speaking to that fact, because a number of local homeless youth providers were pretty gun shy in even revisiting the opportunity because they hadn't seen the young people that they were serving as served through the publicly funded workforce system. The other piece that has been helpful in getting some traction is finding resources, discretionary dollars for pilot type projects. So part of the hope locally is how we can use some of those pilot projects and some of the modeling that CLABS has done to show what the impact would be on WIOA performance levels. So using that real data, putting it through the model, and confronting whether or not there would be an impact. We do have some local providers, workforce providers who are serving individuals experiencing homelessness who say, we'll put our numbers up against our WIOA numbers. We're actually performing better than a lot of people think we would. So how do you confront some of those kinds of things too?
Great, thanks so much. So in the interest of fitting in a few more questions before we need to wrap up the Q&A, Will, I'm going to direct this question over to you. It says, I'm not familiar with transitional jobs. Can you please give a brief explanation and an example?
Sure, happy to, Caitlin. So a transitional job, I think the best way that I could explain it is a position that's in a more supportive environment and is meant to really, I think, more often than not, serve as a bridge into, full-time unsubsidized employment. So if you take CEO's program, for example, what we do is as we hire on the participants as our own employees, we're actually, the nonprofit ourselves is operating those and creating an environment where the crew supervisor is fully understanding of the different types of barriers that our participants are encountering, having just recently been released from incarceration. And so while there's still a high expectation in terms of their day-to-day performance on the job, as different challenges arise, such as, showing up to work late or potentially not handling some type of a conflict or disagreement with a coworker, instead of taking, a kind of a immediately punitive type of recourse that may happen in kind of a more standard employment environment, we're there to sort of help coach them through that type of a situation. And now that's one, I think, one example, but more often I think the best way to describe it is where the job is being sort of managed or operated by an organization that's providing some additional types of supports, so that as the person is in that job, it's helping them develop the types of skills that they can successfully transition into sort of a full-time unsubsidized job that's not sort of where the wages aren't being paid by the community-based organization, but are actually being handled completely by the employer itself. So that's sort of the way that I've tried to describe it in the past.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question, and Erika, I'm going to direct this one over to you. During your presentation, you spoke about one challenge being inadequate WIOA services. Could you be a bit more specific here? Were you talking about inadequate training dollars, staff training, or other inadequate services?
Yeah, I think I mean, the majority of the feedback that we've heard is that it really is coming down to the actual funding. And then I think too, there's just been sort of this ongoing challenge around, given the goals of, serving out of school youth and other populations with barriers to employment, in addition to the actual funding levels, how are we making sure that all one-stops and local boards across the state are adequately supported in being effective with these populations, especially in areas where they historically have not served these populations. And I think there's also been some challenges too with making sure that they are able to connect to community-based organizations and other sort of neighborhood-based, community-based stakeholders that are some of the folks that are on the front lines of serving these communities, or are the entities that, whether it's out of school youth or formerly incarcerated or whatever, that they know of in the community versus the actual workforce development board. I think there's just still a lot of gaps there that aren't going to just be solved by new language or requirements.
Okay, thank you. So with that, in the last few minutes, I'm going to hand it back over to Carrie. I would add that we did have a few questions that we weren't able to answer during our Q&A, and we will try our best to connect with you via email to get your question answered. All right, thank you.
Great, thanks, Katie. So yes, next steps, as I said a couple of times, recording and slides will be made available to you. We'll try and answer any lingering questions. I want to quickly point out that on our National Initiatives website, which is right there at the bottom, we have lots of free toolkits, some related to WIOA, as you see here, but a lot of good resources that are free for you guys to use. We're also going to be having webinars more or less once a month related to similar topics. So please follow us for updates on those. And thank you again to all of our speakers for taking time to share with us all of your knowledge and lessons. I encourage listeners to reach out and connect to speakers, follow their organizations and the work that they're doing. And also thanks to all of you for tuning in, and more importantly for the great work that you do. Thanks everyone, have a great day.